I thought I knew the man I loved, until I realized I was only seeing the surface of a world I was never meant to understand. The night I first met Ethan Blackwood, I did not know I was stepping into a life that would quietly reshape everything I believed about love, trust, and safety. To me, he was just Ethan, calm, attentive, the kind of man who remembered the smallest details about my day, who showed up exactly when he said he would, and who made ordinary moments feel strangely intentional. We lived what looked like a simple, almost peaceful relationship in a quiet American city, where mornings began with coffee runs, weekend walks, and conversations that felt effortless. There were no obvious warning signs, no dramatic red flags, nothing that would suggest the world I was touching had any hidden depth beneath it. And yet, there were moments I could not explain. The way his phone always went silent when I entered the room. The way certain names made his expression tighten for just a fraction of a second before he smiled again. The way strangers sometimes looked at him too long, like they recognized something they were not supposed to acknowledge. I ignored those details because I wanted to believe in the life we were building. I wanted to believe that love was simple, that people were exactly who they appeared to be. But simplicity has a way of breaking when it touches something it does not understand. One evening, while waiting for him to return from what he called a work meeting, I found myself noticing things I had always overlooked before. A black car parked too long across the street. A man in a suit who never stepped inside the nearby cafe, but always seemed to be watching the building. Small inconsistencies that felt meaningless on their own, yet together created a pattern I was not ready to recognize. When Ethan finally walked through the door that night, everything felt the same on the surface, his voice calm, his presence familiar, his smile gentle. But something in the air had changed. It was not what he said, but what he did not say. It was not what he showed me, but what he carefully kept hidden behind silence. I remember asking him a simple question, something casual, something I did not think would matter. And for the first time, he hesitated. Just for a second. A pause so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But I noticed. That was the moment the illusion began to crack, even though I did not yet understand what lay beneath it. I only knew one thing for certain. The man I loved was carrying a life I had never been invited to see, and I was standing at the edge of a truth that was about to change everything. The days after that small crack in my reality began to feel different, even if nothing around me had visibly changed. Life with Ethan Blackwood continued in its usual rhythm, yet I started noticing the rhythm itself was not as simple as I once believed. He still woke up before me most mornings, still made coffee the way I liked it without asking, still walked beside me through quiet streets as if nothing in the world could disturb that balance. And yet, I found myself watching him more closely, listening more carefully, as if my instincts were trying to decode something my mind refused to name. There were moments when he seemed perfectly ordinary, laughing softly at something I said, brushing away tension with ease, looking at me with a kind of attention that felt almost too steady, too controlled. But there were also moments when that same calmness turned distant in ways I could not understand. When his phone vibrated and he would step away without explanation, his expression tightening just slightly before returning as if nothing had happened. When strangers passed him on the street and their eyes lingered too long, not with curiosity, but with something closer to recognition. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that love sometimes makes people overly observant, that I was reading too much in his silence and coincidence. But doubt, once planted, does not stay quiet for long. One afternoon, while we were driving through the city, I noticed a black vehicle keeping a consistent distance behind us. It was not aggressive, not obvious, but deliberate enough to make my attention sharpen. When I mentioned it, Ethan simply glanced through the rearview mirror and smiled. Faintly, telling me it was nothing to worry about. His voice was calm, almost gentle, and yet something in the way he said it made me stop asking questions. That should have comforted me. Instead, it unsettled me in a way I could not explain. The feeling followed me into the next days, subtle but persistent, like a shadow I could not step out of. I began noticing patterns where I had once seen randomness. People who appeared too often in the background of our routines. Conversations that ended just a little too neatly when I entered a room. The sense that Ethan's life, the life I thought I knew, had layers that I was not being allowed to touch. Still I stayed. Not because I was unaware of the questions forming in my mind, but because part of me was afraid of what the answers might do to the version of him I had come to care for. And so I did what many people do when truth begins to feel too heavy. I waited, hoping clarity would come on its own, even as I unknowingly stood closer and closer to the edge of something I was not prepared to understand. The moment I began to accept that something in Ethan's life was not as simple as it appeared, I also began to notice how carefully that simplicity had been maintained around me. It was not as if anyone had ever explicitly hidden anything from me. Instead, it felt more like I had been standing inside a carefully maintained version of reality, one designed to keep me comfortable, even calm, as long as I did not look too closely at the edges. Ethan remained the same in ways that mattered most in daily life. He still remembered my routines, still knew exactly when I needed silence and when I needed conversation, still appeared at my side with that steady presence that made the world feel predictable. Yet the predictability itself started to feel like a structure built over something deeper. I began to notice how certain conversations would pause when I entered a room, not abruptly, but with practiced ease, as if people had already learned what should and should not be said in my presence. I noticed how Ethan's tone would remain unchanged no matter who he spoke to, but his attention would shift in subtle ways when unfamiliar names were mentioned, as if some part of him was always measuring risk without allowing it to surface. One evening, we attended a small gathering that he described as unimportant, something casual involving acquaintances from work. The space was elegant but restrained, filled with polite conversation and controlled laughter. I remember standing near the edge of the room, observing him from a distance, watching how easily he moved through conversations, how naturally others responded to him, even when nothing about his role in the room was clearly defined. It was there, for the first time, that I felt a strange contradiction settle inside me. He looked entirely at ease, yet everything around him seemed subtly aware of his presence in a way no one acknowledged aloud. When our eyes met across the room, he gave me a small, reassuring smile, the kind he always used when he wanted me to feel safe. But instead of comfort, I felt something closer to uncertainty, because I realized I no longer knew what that safety was built on. Later that night, as we left, I noticed a man standing near the exit who did not move when others passed him. His gaze followed Ethan for just a second longer than necessary, and then shifted away with quiet restraint. It was not fear that I saw, and it was not familiarity in the ordinary sense. It was something more controlled, something measured, like recognition wrapped carefully in silence. I did not ask about it. I had stopped asking questions that I was not ready to have answered. Instead, I simply watched as Ethan opened the car door for me, as if the world inside and outside our life could remain separated if I continued to act as though I did not notice the fractures forming between them. And yet, as we drove away into the night, I felt that those fractures were no longer distant. They were becoming part of the space between us, shaping every silence we had yet to speak into words. The evening in the coastal city felt unusually still as Daniel Whitmore sat alone inside the upper floor lounge of a quiet waterfront building, the city lights stretching across the harbor like scattered reflections of a life he had carefully hidden from the world. Across town, Emily Carter was finishing her shift at a small boutique cafe, unaware that every step she took through her ordinary routine had already become part of a larger pattern she could not yet see. Daniel had spent years building an identity that allowed him to move unnoticed among ordinary people, but tonight something had changed in the rhythm he controlled so precisely. A series of subtle reports had reached him through private channels, each one pointing not toward danger, but toward proximity. Someone had been asking questions in places where questions were never welcomed, not aggressively, not recklessly, but with a quiet persistence that made him pause longer than usual. Emily, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of coincidence shaping her days. A stranger she had briefly noticed earlier in the week appeared again at a distance she could not explain, never approaching, never speaking, only present in ways that felt too precise to be accidental. She told herself it was imagination, the product of a long week and too many closing shifts, yet the feeling lingered like a shadow she could not fully dismiss. Daniel reviewed security notes on a discrete device, his expression calm, but increasingly focused, recognizing patterns that others would overlook. The name attached to the background inquiries was not unfamiliar, yet it did not belong to the world she appeared to inhabit. That contradiction unsettled him more than he expected. Instead of reacting immediately, he chose patience, observing rather than intervening, a decision that came less from caution and more from curiosity. Emily continued her life unaware that her routine had become a map being quietly studied by someone she had never met. Her walk home followed the same streets as always, past familiar storefronts and softly lit intersections, yet the air around her felt different, as if distance itself had changed meaning. Daniel, watching from afar through layers of separation, began to realize that this was not a chance encounter forming slowly, but a convergence already in motion long before either of them had noticed. He had spent years avoiding emotional unpredictability, building walls of discipline and control, yet something about her presence in his orbit did not behave according to any pattern he understood. It was not disruption in the usual sense, but alignment that refused to explain itself. As night deepened, both of them moved through their separate worlds, unaware that the space between them was no longer empty. It was filling quietly with recognition, shaped not by force or intention, but by timing that neither could yet name. And in that growing silence, the distance between observer and unknown subject began to collapse in ways neither of them was prepared to resist. That morning arrived with an unfamiliar tension beneath the surface of ordinary life, as Emily Carter followed her usual routine, stepping out into the early sunlight with a sense that something in her environment had shifted in ways she could not logically explain. The city appeared unchanged, yet every detail felt slightly more deliberate, as if her awareness had been quietly sharpened without her consent. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore remained in controlled motion, reviewing updated observations that confirmed what he had already begun to suspect the night before. The patterns surrounding her movements were no longer random. They formed a structure that suggested influence rather than coincidence, and that realization forced him into a level of attention he rarely allowed himself to maintain for anything outside his direct control. Emily stopped briefly at a street corner cafe, noticing once again the same distant presence she had registered before, a man who never approached but always seemed positioned within the boundaries of her awareness. She told herself it was confirmation bias, yet her instincts refused to settle. Daniel observed from a distance that did not require physical proximity, his understanding of her environment built through fragments of behavior, timing, and repetition. He noticed how she hesitated for half a second longer at intersections when she sensed she was being watched, even though there was no visible confirmation of it. That hesitation was not fear. It was awareness without direction, and it created a question in his mind that he had not intended to form. As the day progressed, Emily experienced small disruptions in her routine that felt too precise to dismiss entirely. A delayed message, a missed call that never came through clearly, a moment where a familiar route seemed unfamiliar for reasons she could not articulate. None of it was significant on its own, yet together it created a pattern of subtle disorientation that made her question her own perception. Daniel, meanwhile, reviewed the structure of her daily movement with increasing focus, not as surveillance, but as analysis of something he could not yet classify. She did not behave like someone attempting to avoid attention, nor like someone accustomed to being watched. She moved with the confidence of someone unaware of any external narrative intersecting with her life. That contradiction drew his attention deeper than he intended. By late afternoon, Emily found herself pausing longer than necessary outside her workplace, scanning the street with a feeling she could not name. Daniel was present at a distance again, positioned in a way that allowed him to remain unseen while observing the exact space she occupied. For the first time, he recognized that his presence in her proximity was no longer incidental. It was consistent enough to be measurable, and yet still unacknowledged by her directly. That imbalance created a tension that did not resolve easily. As evening approached, both of them moved closer to the same intersection of routine paths, each unaware that the structure separating observer and observed had already begun to weaken. What had started as distant awareness was now becoming shared space, and neither of them had yet decided whether that convergence was accidental or inevitable. The evening arrived with a quiet weight, as if the city itself had begun to slow its breath. Emily Carter left work later than usual, stepping into the sidewalk lights that reflected off wet pavement from an earlier light rain. She did not notice anything unusual at first, only the familiar rhythm of her walk home through streets she had crossed countless times. Yet something subtle had changed in the way she experienced them, as if the space between each sound and movement had become more noticeable. Daniel Whitmore was already in position several blocks away, not following in the traditional sense, but existing within the same shifting geometry of distance that had been forming over the past days. He observed without urgency, his attention steady, tracking patterns that no longer felt like coincidence, but also not yet like intention. Emily paused at a crosswalk, her eyes briefly scanning the opposite side of the street. For a moment, she felt the strange certainty that someone was present in her awareness without being visible, a sensation that made no logical sense but refused to disappear. She dismissed it as fatigue and continued walking, yet her pace changed slightly, slower than before, more deliberate. Daniel noticed that change immediately. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it confirmed that her awareness was no longer entirely unidirectional. She was beginning to sense the structure forming around her, even if she could not define it. As she turned onto a quieter street, the environment grew less crowded, the noise of the city thinning into distant echoes. Daniel adjusted his position accordingly, maintaining distance while ensuring continuity of observation. He had no intention of disrupting her path, only understanding it. Yet understanding had begun to shift into something less neutral, something closer to recognition. Emily stopped briefly outside a closed storefront, glancing at her reflection in the glass. For a brief moment, she felt the uncomfortable thought that her life had become slightly misaligned, as if something external had adjusted its perspective on her without permission. She looked away quickly, continuing forward, unaware that Daniel stood within visual range across the street, hidden by the ordinary motion of passing pedestrians. He did not step closer. He did not reveal himself. Instead, he remained still, observing the exact moment she moved past a threshold neither of them could name. That moment carried no dramatic change, no visible shift, yet something intangible settled into place. The separation between them was no longer defined by distance alone. It had become awareness shared unevenly across silence. As Emily reached the final stretch toward her apartment, she felt a growing certainty that her routines were no longer entirely hers in the way they had always been. Daniel, watching from afar, understood that the point of observation had begun to reverse its direction, even if only slightly. She was no longer just being seen. She was beginning to see without knowing what she was looking at. And in that quiet exchange of incomplete awareness, the boundary between their lives became thinner than either of them could yet acknowledge. The night settled over the city with a quiet intensity as Emily Carter finally reached the street near her apartment, her footsteps slower now, almost hesitant, though she could not explain why. The familiar path that once required no thought now felt slightly unfamiliar, as if her attention had become more sensitive to details she used to ignore. Behind her, at a distance that no passerby would question, Daniel Whitmore maintained his presence within the flow of the city, neither approaching nor retreating, simply aligned with her movement through space. He had begun to notice that the nature of his observation was changing. It was no longer purely analytical. It had become anticipatory, as if he were no longer only watching her actions, but also the subtle shifts in how she experienced her own environment. Emily paused briefly at the base of her apartment building, looking up at the entrance as though confirming something she could not fully name. The lights above the door flickered softly, a normal occurrence, yet in that moment it felt slightly more pronounced, drawing her attention longer than it should have. She shook off the feeling and continued inside, unaware that Daniel had stopped across the street, his gaze fixed not on her directly, but on the exact point where her awareness had just lingered. That moment carried significance for him, not because of what she had done, but because of what she had almost perceived. Inside the building, Emily moved through the lobby with routine familiarity, greeting no one, noticing nothing unusual, yet internally unsettled by a sense that her environment had become subtly less predictable. She pressed the elevator button and waited, her reflection faint in the polished metal doors. Daniel observed from a position of stillness outside, recognizing that the boundary between distance and connection had shifted again. What had once been surveillance had gradually transformed into something less defined, a state where observation no longer felt one-directional. He realized that his presence, even when unseen, was now part of the structure she was beginning to sense without understanding. Emily entered the elevator, the doors closing with a soft mechanical sound that marked a temporary separation between her and the outside world. Yet even as the elevator ascended, she felt the lingering impression that something remained connected to her path, something she could not locate but could no longer completely dismiss. Daniel turned away from the building at last, not because the observation was complete, but because continuation was no longer dependent on proximity alone. The pattern had stabilized into something self-sustaining. She was aware enough to feel its edges, and he was aware enough to recognize that awareness forming. As the city continued its quiet motion through the night, both of them existed within the same unfolding space, separated by distance, but no longer isolated in perception, moving closer not through action, but through the gradual collapse of unnoticed boundaries. The morning after carried a strange stillness, as if the city had not fully reset from the events of the night before. Emily Carter woke earlier than usual, sitting on the edge of her bed for a long moment without immediately reaching for her phone or beginning her routine. There was a lingering sensation she could not identify, something that felt like awareness without memory, as though her mind had registered patterns she had not consciously understood. She eventually stood, moving through her apartment with slow precision, noticing details that had never seemed important before, such as the way morning light angled differently across her kitchen counter or how distant city noise seemed slightly more layered than usual. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore reviewed the continuity of the previous night's observations, not with urgency, but with a steady focus that suggested confirmation rather than discovery. The pattern had not broken. If anything, it had stabilized further, becoming more coherent in ways that were difficult to ignore. Emily's behavior showed subtle adaptation. She was not reacting to anything visible, but she was no longer moving through her environment with complete unconscious ease. That change mattered more than any direct acknowledgement. Emily left her apartment later that morning, stepping into a world that appeared unchanged to anyone else, yet felt incrementally different to her. She paused briefly outside the building, scanning the street without knowing why, her attention lingering in places it normally would not. Daniel observed from a distance that had become habitual rather than strategic. He was no longer positioning himself based on necessity, but maintaining presence within a developing structure that no longer required constant adjustment. She began walking toward her usual destination, but her pace varied slightly, as if her internal sense of direction was recalibrating in real time. Daniel noticed this immediately. It was not uncertainty, but responsiveness. She was reacting to something she could not identify, which meant the boundary between his awareness and her perception was no longer one-sided. As she crossed an intersection, Emily briefly stopped, looking around as though expecting something to resolve itself into clarity. Nothing did. Yet the moment itself lingered in her awareness longer than it should have, leaving behind a faint impression that her environment was not entirely passive. Daniel did not move closer. He understood that proximity was no longer the determining factor. What mattered now was synchronization. Two independent paths were beginning to reflect each other in timing, in hesitation, in attention. Emily continued walking, unaware that her smallest pauses were now part of a pattern being recognized from afar. Daniel, in turn, recognized that observation had evolved into alignment, not connection in the emotional sense, but structural correspondence between two lives that had not yet intersected directly. As the day progressed, both moved through their separate routines, yet each carried an increasing awareness of something just beyond comprehension. Emily could not define it, but she no longer fully dismissed it either. Daniel did not pursue resolution, only continuity. And within that quiet balance, the distance between them became less about space and more about timing, as if the city itself was preparing to bring two unrelated lives into the same moment without announcing when it would finally occur. The city reached a point in the day where light and sound blended into a steady rhythm, and yet for Emily Carter, everything felt slightly more deliberate than before, as if her perception had adjusted itself without permission. She moved through her morning routine with careful awareness, noticing details she normally ignored, such as the timing of footsteps around her, the brief pauses in traffic signals, and the way reflections in glass seemed to hold her attention longer than expected. She did not understand why her focus kept sharpening, but she no longer dismissed the feeling entirely. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore observed the final stage of a pattern that had been forming quietly over several days. What began as scattered observations had now become a consistent structure, one that no longer depended on distance or direct surveillance. Emily's movements were no longer just being tracked. They were beginning to align in timing with his own awareness, as though the space between action and observation had shortened into something more immediate. Emily left her apartment later than usual, pausing at the entrance for a moment longer than necessary. She looked down the street, not searching for anything specific, but sensing that something about her environment required acknowledgement. Nothing appeared out of place, yet her hesitation remained. Daniel stood several blocks away, no longer following in any traditional sense, but positioned within the same unfolding sequence of movement that seemed to guide both of them toward a shared point in the city. He had stopped thinking of it as pursuit. It was becoming convergence, a gradual reduction of distance that no longer required intention to continue. Emily walked through familiar streets, yet each corner felt slightly more significant than before, as if she were moving through a version of the city that had begun to respond to her presence. She stopped briefly near a pedestrian crossing, her gaze shifting across the opposite sidewalk. For a moment, she felt a strange certainty that something important was nearby, though she could not identify what that meant. Daniel, on the opposite side of that same space, remained still. This was the closest they had been without acknowledgement, separated only by motion and the absence of recognition. He did not step forward. He did not need to. The structure between them was already collapsing through awareness alone. Emily continued forward, unaware that she had already passed through the edge of his direct observation field, entering a shared space where presence was no longer theoretical. Daniel watched her complete that crossing without interruption, understanding that the moment of connection was no longer about contact, but realization. She was close enough now that the system of distance he had maintained for so long no longer functioned in the same way. It had been replaced by mutual awareness forming in uneven stages, one aware of observation, the other becoming aware of being perceived. As Emily reached the far side of the street, she slowed again, not stopping this time, but adjusting her pace as though something within her had synchronized with an external rhythm she could not hear but could feel. Daniel observed that adjustment and understood that the final separation between them was no longer physical. It was perceptual, and in that quiet alignment, both of them unknowingly entered the same moment of recognition, where two unrelated lives had finally arrived at the point where observation could no longer remain one-sided, and the space between them ceased to behave like distance.